Okay, well, it seems that we are now live and rolling. So I'm sure there's quite a lot of people that are already on here, and apologies those for have been waiting around for a couple of minutes. As always, we just encountered a couple of technical issues, but we're live and ready to go now. So welcome to everybody. Today I'm joined by Rory Sutherland, of course, the leader of the Mad Masters course. And Tom Ridges, the CEO and founder of Herdify. For those of you that have seen the emails that have gone out as well, that have the new ebook from Herdify talking about behavioral science in the real world and why individualism is essentially bullshit, that shows exactly why Herdify are such a valued partner of the course and why everyone that joins absolutely loves these sessions with Tom and Rory, because they are great discussions. They're great for clips. They're massively popular on TikTok. So we'll get straight into it. And the topic of today's session is essentially talking about challenger brands and what you can do when essentially you can't outspend your competition. Can you try and outsmart them, and really what's happening in the world right now? So without further ado, I will throw to Tom to kind of take us away on that topic.
Yeah,
Superb.
nice one. Thanks, Sam. Yeah, I think whenever that question gets posed, how can you sort of, outspend, not outspend, how can you outsmart? I always try and take people back to the Facebook example, right? So let's forget Meta, the behemoth it is today. When Mark set that up in 2007 in a college, I like to think that if he'd set it up today, people would have said to him, right, find who your target audience is, right? You're going to target college students. And then let's try and reach all of them, as many as we can, as quickly as we can, right? We need to go and raise $1 billion from VCs. We're going to flood every channel, and we're going to convince every single student that we're the best social platform out there. And I suspect if they did that, we'd have never heard of them, right? But what Zuck did, which was actually, we can get technical about it if people care, but it was actually because of his product. But what they ended up doing was concentrating on a very small group of offline social influence. Okay, so they started at one college. Harvard was first. They didn't let people with other college email addresses come in. You had to be a Harvard student. People are inviting their friends from all over North America. As we all know, when you go to university, you travel across country and you cross-pollinate. But they were very strict. One college, they then went to another college. That's Columbia, Stanford, and then Yale. And they did this really, I'm not sure it was a strategy from a kind of growth point of view, but it turned out to be very clever in that they triggered from the offline networks. And I think when I think about...
Oh, by the way, in the UK, it started with Cambridge.
Exactly. Same playbook, right? Rather than come and try and launch to the whole UK, go where the social networks are. But I think what that begs for is a question that I'm always thinking of is, I think you probably said it to me, you're much smarter than me, but it's almost like where not to advertise is almost a really valid thing, particularly when you don't have budgets. And sort of that Facebook example wasn't where are the students, it was how can we get rid of most of the students? How can we get rid of, how can we work out where not to advertise, i.e. most places, and just focus really strategically, which is genius. And it's a playbook rolled out by tech companies day after day. But consumer brands don't seem to do it as often in the in the product space.
I like that point there, Tom, that you were sort of going into, like where not to advertise, being as valid a question as sort of where to advertise. That's one I wanted to throw to you, Rory, on that as well. I mean, what are your sort of thoughts around that, Rory? And what have you sort of seen the best examples of that, or even probably what people might love are the worst examples of that as well?
Well, assuming you have limited resources, there's one approach which is to concentrate on a sweet spot. But I'm a big devotee of the Warren Buffett, Charlie Munger axiom, which is always invert, which is don't just ask the question, who are we trying to reach? You can actually get a whole new creative insight by asking the opposite question, which is who should we not bother with for now? And I mean, it's very interesting you mentioned Zuckerberg. In the field of classical direct marketing, there was both a media approach and a creative approach, which really I always described as one sentence that was worth $1 billion. which was the American Express card invitation to apply letter, which started with the sentence, quite frankly, comma, the American Express card is not for everyone. And, you know, if they had, why that was so critical is, in a sense, they knew they were going to use direct mail as the only effective means of acquisition. Yeah. Direct mail has lots of disadvantages in terms of cost of reach, but it has one big advantage, which is you can make the person who receives it feel special. And similarly, I mean, I think, you know, a large part of this, by the way, the other phrase I use, which I think is useful for Herdify, is real life is a medium too. Okay, which is we don't just sort of walk around in a daze and then occasionally we get exposed to a bit of bought media communication, and we use that bit of bought media communication to kind of recalibrate our perception of the brand, and then we move on. Okay, we're influenced by everything, the people around us, what's on the shelves, what the supermarkets seem to be stocking a lot of, what your friends consume, the car your friends drive, whether your neighbors have a solar panel, and so forth. And we're a herd species. I mean, there are two fundamental default modes. If you look at your digital camera, it has a kind of, well, not you have a digital camera anymore because you use your phones, but you know, every digital camera has a kind of default setting, which is what it does in the absence of other overriding information. And two huge default modes in the human brain are do what I've done before, which is habit, and do what everybody else does, which is herdification or social copying.
Do you know, oh, sorry, you were going to go?
They're perfectly rational, by the way, because if you don't have enough information to make a decision, okay, maybe other people do. And copying them, therefore, is socially rational when you have limited search costs, search resources. Okay, if you find yourself in a new tribe of people and everybody's eating the purple berries and no one eats the yellow berries, best default mode is, unless you run out of purple berries, don't try the yellow ones. Yeah. And there's a perfectly good evolutionary reason for it, which is all these people seem to be doing this thing and they're still alive. Therefore, it's much more sensible to copy people who are alive than to experiment and end up copying people who ended up dead.
Yeah. Yeah, I love that. And I was thinking about this the other day. I've ended up in a bit of a YouTube rabbit warren of Jimmy Carr. Big fan of his. I know you're talking to him at MadFest. He's local to us. And what I always love about his content is Jimmy Carr, you know, I'm sure most people have seen and come across his content, but he's a stand-up comedian here in the UK. But he deliberately has content that's on the edge of what's acceptable. You know, he's a very well-dressed, middle-class chap who just says some frankly disgusting stuff sometimes.
Yeah.
And what I love is in the room, everyone in that room has gone there, knows who he is, knows that he's on the edge there. And when he says his sort of extreme stuff, everyone's outsourcing their opinion of whether they should laugh or not to the rest of the room. You can hear the kind of the silence, the deep breaths, and the should I laugh, should I not? And then inevitably someone laughs and you know, the ripples break out. And I just, you know, love that everyone would react very differently if they're watching that on YouTube or at home on their sofa. But what's acceptable, even what we find funny, is driven by that room of strangers.
Do you know what I learned on YouTube last night? Because one of the great joys of having YouTube Premium is in any hotel in the world now, you can basically watch YouTube Premium. Oh. And I was watching this documentary about Frank Sinatra. His manager actually staged auditions for girls who could scream really loudly. And basically seeded all Frank's concerts with girls who had really loud screams.
There we go.
So, yeah, there you go. And actually, they knew this. I mean, there's a famous thing, which is that if the people in the front stand up to give you a standing ovation, everybody else does. Your influence over a standing ovation depends on what the front row does, very largely, because they're visible, whereas the people behind you aren't. Yeah, you know, the people behind you could be stripped naked for all you know, and throwing that, you know. So that's the kind of thing which, is really, really interesting.
There was actually, I know of one. There may be many. There's a paper written on the optimum way to manipulate a standing ovation in terms of maximizing visibility. So front row, and then where do you seed everyone else to get the max visibility with the fewest number of people? How do you trigger the biggest cascade with the fewest inputs, which it's brilliant because it just comes down to a lot of this that, you know, repeatable once you understand that it's about visibility. So it's good to know that Sinatra did it as well.
And actually, hyper concentration in a place. I mean, by the way, you mentioned a lovely thing, didn't you? I think when you looked at data on Ford sales,
Mm-hmm.
and there's a particular cluster of really loyal Ford buyers that which persists years after the dealership closed. Is that right?
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, one of our clients, they're a Ford dealership, and they were in the West Country, and they closed. And then when we were doing some analysis, we said, well, look, we can detect that people are really passionate and talking about and influencing each other about the brand, and they've got to drive past 2 or 3 other Ford garages to get to the other one, and they're willing to make that extra journey because fundamentally, you kind of talked about the evolutionary side there. If everyone else is still buying from that one that's 2 hours away, the short piece in your head the shortcut in your head says, well, there's probably other things wrong with the local ones, or there's got to be a good reason they're all driving 2 hours. No one stopped to ask the question to each other and go, quickly, there's 1 hour away. Is there a reason that you're still driving 3 hours away? We just take the fact they're doing it as, well, they've obviously thought about it, so I'll copy them, and that reinforcement never ends, and therefore the memory is persistent, which is beautiful in terms of just how it appears on a map.
It has real importance, by the way, normalization. If you're interested, any of you interested in sort of environmental questions, there's just as if you have, in some countries they pay people to visibly drink Guinness in a pub early on, because if there's someone drinking Guinness in the pub, Guinness has a great advantage as a beer, as being basically visibly distinguishable from all other beers. Cider has a disadvantage until you put ice in it, which is no one can tell you're drinking cider, not lager.
Yeah.
Okay. And so they actually exploit that by, it's not a bad job, I guess, turn up at the pub really early at opening time. You're not allowed to drink that much, but you have to stand around visibly consuming Guinness. In the same way, solar panels, there's this massive cluster effect where if 2 people on the street get them, then every subsequent sale becomes easier and easier.
Yeah. Two points there. The Guinness one I find fascinating because you've all seen the rise of Guinness Zero. Okay, now I'm not a Guinness drinker. I've probably had 1 pint of Guinness in the last 10 years, but I think I've probably had 10 pints of Guinness Zero in the last 6 weeks. Right? And that's not because I've gone on a taste test and think what's the best zero beers or what I want to spend my time is. I play paddle with a bunch of guys. At the end of the event, they all have a Guinness Zero, and it's just easier for me to fit in. Even knowing what I know about our business, I still conform, and I just started drinking it more, not because I think Guinness is a better drink. It's just what my mates are drinking when we're drinking zeros, and I think they've played a great move. And I guess it's fueled by what you're saying. It's also distinctly obvious, when people say, "Are you drinking Guinness?" Because it's, and you can say, "Oh, no."
And by the way, like vaping, zero alcohol beer is a really, really interesting phenomenon because it represents a behavior which was probably a fantasy of both Public Health England when it existed and the Department for Transport.
Yeah.
Which is, wouldn't it be great if we could get people to go to the pub, and at least one of them, in the case of the Department for Transport, or a lot of them, in the case of Public Health England, just started having, because one problem with Britain was actually another social effect, which was the round system, which is you were forced to drink at the speed of the heaviest drinker in the group, basically. Okay. And so having the option to do zebra drinking, which is where you alternate zero alcohol and alcoholic, or the driver doesn't drink at all, or people who just don't want to drink that much can actually continue to participate in the social, the social compulsion, which is the round system, without either feeling left out or getting pissed.
Yeah.
Now, what's so fascinating about that is it's a total marketing fantasy for, as I said, the Department for Transport and Public Health England, but it happened bottom up.
Yeah.
It's undoubtedly a thing that was just a phenomenon that started. There is an interesting question psychologically, which is no one anticipates that zero alcohol wine is going anywhere. And why is that? Which is just an interesting question. But it's a really interesting phenomenon. And there's also, It's an extraordinary potent thing. There's famously, a colleague of mine doing research said, that effectively social cues are an enormous determinant of behavior. They're often quite inexpensive to actually engineer, particularly if you can localize them, and yet they get ridiculously little attention.
Yeah. Well, interesting when you said the bottom up side, there's also that from an age group point of view. I was reading something, I think it was in the FT, which shows the context of the article being there, to be honest with you. But they were talking about, the certain generation of leaders that read the FT, you would probably not tar with the brush that says they are your typical alcohol-free drinker. Okay. But actually what they're saying is, because a lot of the younger people and that movement's spreading, actually at that middle management level, there's a bunch of people who are now turning up on a Monday morning who are clear-headed, and there's that herd mentality is forming in terms of, well, you actually feel left out if you're the one that's not clear-headed. So it's starting to propagate into, it's the beauty of how this spreading works. It's now spreading even further into the kind of dark reaches who you would never say would enter that world, but no. They don't want to be this new herd that's forming, this herd that can perform on a Monday morning, clarity of thought, and they don't want to be outside that. So it's causing that, that inclusion higher up as well, which I thought was fascinating.
I think it's a very, very interesting question with vaping, by the way, which I think is quite concerning. I was on a podcast about this a few days ago, which is generally middle-class people who are in the decision-making world don't know that many people who smoke. So they see vaping as unnecessary. If you go to a working class place, you go outside a vape shop, or you go outside actually the corner shop, there were sort of 600 of those Lost Mary stickers stuck on the bin, where people had come out of the shop, peeled the thing off the bottom, stuck it on the thing. And I suddenly said, what you've got to realize is every one of those stickers, I'm not encouraging littering, but every one of those stickers is a packet of cigarettes that someone didn't smoke.
Yeah.
Okay, that's, and so one of the problems you get in marketing is that marketing people often exist in a milieu which is completely atypical of the milieu in which their customers find themselves.
Mm-hmm. Those stickers also act as social reinforcement. It reminds me of the Red Bull example that you'll both be familiar with, and maybe we've talked about before, but in the early days, they stuffed the bins outside nightclubs with empty cans of Red Bull. So people thought, oh, I didn't drink that tonight, but everyone else did and had a good night. Maybe I'm missing out. And I imagine
maybe I'm missing out.
Stickers are having the same effect. And maybe in a positive way, that maybe that's the tipping point for someone who's going in to buy a pack of cigarettes and they see 50 stickers and they're like, well, do you know what? Maybe I should try it. It'll be interesting to see if there's any data around that, to see that repeated exposure to that sticker reinforces that people like me are making the switch from cigarettes to vaping, which, as you say, from a public health point of view, is a no-brainer.
The non-alcohol, we should, with no alcohol beer, we shouldn't discount the fact that obviously it got a lot better. Okay, it's not only about a herd effect. There's another marketing effect, which is always claimed probably by Lucky Saint, which is that everybody else launched their low alcohol beer by saying it's a low alcohol beer, which was basically saying it's not that shit honest.
Yeah.
And Lucky Saint went out and launched with it's a great beer, and by the way, it's really low in alcohol.
Mm-hmm.
Now, so there are other factors, but what's undoubtedly true is that somehow there's a social norm which probably starts locally. It then reaches a tipping point, and then once you reach the tipping point, I think there's a kind of escape velocity. Okay, I talked about habit and social copying. There's this kind of escape velocity where something goes from seeming weird and is anxious making because it's an unfamiliar behavior. And that's why, by the way, those of you who know about the Ehrenberg Bass Institute, many of you know what the Ehrenberg is about. It's Andrew Ehrenberg and his fantastic work on the statistics of, the dominance in brand leadership and double jeopardy and all that stuff. Bass is the Bass diffusion curve, which is a sigmoid curve, which shows how new behaviors, new products, new technologies effectively how they disperse through the population. And it's basically slow, then faster and faster and faster. And then as you exhaust the possible market space, which, by the way, in the case of mobile phones is probably 100%, but in the case of air fryers is probably 50%. You know, and in the case of Japanese toilets is probably 10%. Okay, you'll see exactly that same pattern. And why that's really, really important to know is a lot of people give up on ideas too soon because they go, this isn't really taking off. And the reason it's not taking off isn't because of the product or the customer, it's because of other people.
Yeah, just to go back for a second there, when you were talking about the stuff about Lucky Saint, it was a question that you posed to me earlier, Tom, and I kind of wanted to throw it back to you, of like how do brands use that aspect of herd mentality to not just grow, but grow profitably as well, in a sense, because obviously Lucky Saint have now been massively popular and been a massive success. So what is there a trick there with brands, or how does that work in your eyes?
Yeah, and I was going to bring that back to what Rory said, to honestly, because I am obviously hugely biased about the power of herd mentality, right? And I talk louder about the power of herd mentality because I think it's an underrepresented conversation. But to Rory's point, like there's so much more going on under the hood, right? There's a load more modules in the course than just herd mentality, right? So how do we influence the individual? How do you build good products? All of these things have to happen. But I think what's interesting is when you have a great product like Lucky Saint, when you have some great marketing behind it, I changed how it's presented. This isn't a lower quality product that we've given you. It's a great beer and it happens to be. I think once you've got those two ingredients, what you're then looking for is, well, how do you find where that early traction is taking place? Okay, because you've got those first two things, a good product, a really strong message that positions it well. If you can then find the groups of people who are already sharing it, because I have a higher susceptibility to drink it if 5 of my friends are, 10 of my friends are, 20 of my friends. And actually, I try to stick away from too many virus analogies, but the more of us that pile in locally, the more of us expose it to people on the edge of our networks, our social networks, and that causes the spread. So it means we can cause the spreading to occur quicker, that adoption model that Rory talked, the BAS curve that Rory talked through, we can cause that to accelerate locally. And if you do that cleverly, like I mentioned about Facebook, those areas start to come together and then we can get faster adoption at a national scale. And that's with herd mentality being part of it. It doesn't shortcut all the other stuff. If I launched the world's crappiest beer with a crap message tomorrow and said, I'm just going to bank on herd mentality, I'm still going to be a poor man on Friday. Bringing it all together and bringing in the herd, I think, is a way that brands, particularly challenger brands, can compete against the momentum, right, that the category leaders or the social norms have. Does that make sense, Sam? I did answer that in the right way. I'm not appreciating.
Yeah. No, really interesting. I mean, Roy, do you have any more thoughts on that as well? I'm kind of trying to throw it to both of you here.
There's an interesting question from someone who's launching a collagen brand who I've spoken to separately. And that's something which you drink, which has really major implications, particularly for skin and appearance and everything else. And a lot of people think that it's collagen and something else are going to be the two big things in sort of what you might call the health space. Now, it might be that the answer there, get in touch with me later, because someone came to me, a very interesting woman who runs this menopause brand where they license brands as approved for people, postmenopausal women. And they've got a partnership with Morrison's where there's actually a section in a Morrison's store dedicated to this thing. So getting a now, I mean, collagen will spread way beyond that as a target audience, but starting that as a focus group, that's your equivalent of Harvard.
Yeah.
Okay. It might be very, very interesting if you have a conversation with a lady who's currently on holiday because she's gone off the grid, but I will be back in touch with her in a week. So if you can email me and remind me to put you in touch, that will be one of the opportunities, going in at Morrison's and then, that will enter a conversation in that, people going through or who have been through the menopause will have conversations about it to other people in the same position, but they probably won't have conversations about it with random people in the pub. So that, there might be an interesting area where you start concentrated and I mean, there have been a lot of marketing successes of that kind. San Pellegrino water was only available in Pizza Express. That was back in my student days in 1988-7. The only place you came across San Pellegrino was Pizza Express because it wanted to establish itself as Italian. There was a beer called Rolling Rock, which was very successful at the time, which would only sell itself in really like American places, like Ed's Easy Diner or Johnny Rockets. Okay.
Yeah.
And so sometimes there's this other strategy which ultimately relies on start concentrated and then create a super spreader event effectively, to use the viral mentality, which might be really, really interesting. But, it's worth noting there are some things where the effect won't be huge in the sense that hemorrhoid cream, if we're being honest about it, it's, I hope, consumed in private. Okay. I'm all for campaigning for people to breastfeed in public. I don't think I'm going to join the campaign for people to be able to apply hemorrhoid cream in public. Okay. And it tends to be bought slightly furtively and da-di-da-di-da-di-da. Yeah. Okay. Now there you can still achieve those effects. It's probably through things like facings on the shelves. If there are 3 lots of whatever it is and only one of the competing brand, people will infer that you sell more of this thing. I mean, there was do you want an extraordinary case of this, which was implication of popularity? The great success of Walker's, which to me, as someone who doesn't come from Leicester, I thought unfairly was the red squirrel which drove out Golden Wonder and Smith's crisps. And made salt and vinegar green, which, as we all know, is completely wrong. Okay, sorry to get onto that, but their huge success was this: they noticed that more and more people were buying crisps in multi-packs from supermarkets, relative to purchases from small shops. They introduced a load of flavor variants, weird flavors. Now, most people don't buy those weird flavors. I can't remember what the statistics were at the time. It was like 90% of people were ready salted salt and vinegar. That's right. Ready salted salt and vinegar and cheese and onion or something. And then there was like a 10% of people who bought prawn cocktail or beef and onion or something. Okay. But the weird flavors just gave them total shelf dominance because they had 3 feet of the shelves and Golden Wonder only had 1. And so we use these inferences of what's everybody else buying, even in the physical retail environment as well.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I love that. You mentioned something interesting about solar and renewables, and I think actually there's a link here with collagen as well, which is also trust, because it's one thing buying a packet of crisps. I might explore another brand. The cost to me of getting that wrong is relatively low, but actually taking any health supplements, ingesting collagen based on the claims of the brand alone, because not many brands are known for self-defeating claims on their product. Actually, I'm outsourcing the trust of that product and the quality of that product to people around me. And the same with solar or heat pumps. I don't want to spend 25 grand on a heat pump installation if it's going to be a dud and I'm going to have to rip it out and put something else in. So it's a safety piece, which I think is By the way, I'd also add, that there's a normalization job to be done with solar panels. Now, interestingly, some people are starting to market portable ones, by which I mean you don't have to install them permanently in your house. When there's a sunny day, you just basically prop them up in your garden. Now, okay, that's a good idea because it involves a lot less commitment. Okay, I mean, I would support that, even though if you're a purist, you go, no, you have to cover the whole south-facing roof that you have with these bloody things. The second thing about that, by the way, is when you start to sell solar panels in John Lewis, rather than selling them through weird suppliers and specialist companies you've never heard of, okay, that will be a major kind of breakthrough, a kind of escape velocity moment, I think. Yeah. I imagine... I'd be intrigued on the portable ones. That sounds like a really strong thing in America when you've got loads of space.
Weirdly, I was in Morocco a couple of weeks ago, and there's heaps of people doing massive cycles like across the desert and between these major cities, and they're on a bicycle, and it looked like they were towing something behind them, but they were towing a solar panel behind their push bike. probably to charge things across the whole day while they were riding, because they would be riding all day and they'd want to be able to charge things and camp overnight and then keep going. First time I'd ever seen it, but it was so weird just to see.
Yeah. Let's see that.
So you go, Tom.
No, I've noticed something that the more conversation I've had recently, there's a lot more people talking about geo when they're talking about marketing. Lots of independents. I know WPP have got a big focus on geo. And the question I've been pondering is, do we think, geo used to be used a lot, then we moved away into sort of IDs and trying to track people online for whatever we were doing. Do we think geo is going to bring in a more human approach to marketing and creativity again, or have we ever lost that? My thinking being, because geo is naturally grounded where people live, it incentivizes to think more about the people in those towns as opposed to anonymous UIDs and just random strings of numbers and abstract stuff in the ether. So do we actually think this popular of geo coming back around again is a good thing for what we're talking about as a group?
Well, I'll give you an interesting example, which is that BT, when I worked on BT sort of rollout of cable to the premises, they had a kind of obligation to keep government happy by not concentrating on high potential areas, which in some ways was, you could look at the same parallel with electric cars, just by dint of people being rich and shit. Okay. The southeast of England is going to have a lot more electric cars than say the northwest, or Scotland would be the obvious extreme, or rural Wales. Okay. Now, in one way, you need to obviously have charger infrastructure everywhere because it's kind of democratic, but equally you do need to upweight certain areas, and thinking geographically is really important. I'll give you a very good reason why, by the way, which is one of the things I always used to tell my team is stay up quite late and watch the general election results come in. And they said, why? What's that got to do with my job? And I said, because it reminds you how many places there are that aren't sort of central London. Okay? So, literally you have these group of people who have disproportionate influence who spend their time in 5 out of 648 constituencies. They think of London. I remember when the Brexit results came through, there was a massive leave vote in Bexley. And I said, well, it's not true that all of London is voting Remain. Bexley has voted 68% to leave. A load of people flooded in and said, Bexley's not in London, it's in Kent. And this poor little person pipes up and goes, it's actually called the London Borough of Bexley. Okay, it's absolutely in London. And yet, literally, the way, just thinking geographically, is hugely important for all kinds of reasons, because it's very, very easy, particularly if you don't have a car, okay, that there are whole swathes of the country that you literally never see, because trains and planes, I kind of hate them. And this is a really weird argument, okay, but I'm going to take an argument which is pro-car and anti-train, just controversially, because
this is new.
Because trains are wonderful environmentally and da-da-da-da-da. But they're centripetal. They concentrate people into places where there's a train station. So if you don't have a car, you might know central Newcastle, you might know a bit of central Manchester. You see what I mean? But if you don't have a car, 90, by the way, that's a really interesting fact. Okay, 90% of all journey miles, I think, in the UK are actually by car. Wow, okay, so this idea that you can say, oh, if we just built 2 more railways, we could get everybody out of their cars, is absolute nonsense. And I do have a strong feeling that, there is this fundamental danger. We had a planner at Ogilvy who, after the Brexit referendum, just took his team on trips to Stoke-on. Ironically, they went by train, so they still didn't really see what was going on. But he went to Stoke-on-Trent and places like this and said, look, some of you people were probably born in places like this, but most of you weren't. We need to go out there and just meet people and talk to them, because we're clearly out of touch, because we never anticipated this.
Yeah. No, I don't want to lose that point, but I think it's linked. I've started using the line bikes around London. It's still within London, but actually, even over the last month, I've seen more of London. I've worked up in town for 15 years, and I'm now riding around, looking around, going, I didn't know this was here. I didn't know this linked to there. So, to extrapolate that out, if we can do that, if I could do that across the country, I'd have a much better view, because I had this view of London was Marylebone train station and then a few select tube stops that I had to get out at regular offices I visit, and then it's back out to to Buckinghamshire, and that was sort of my view of London.
Yeah, it's like it's a hit and run visit to London, isn't it? Yeah, absolutely.
Whereas now, and actually, what's interesting, because I'm a big fan of cycle helmets. Like I just think everyone should wear a cycle helmet. You only get one chance. And I've found this great, I haven't got it with me, this great foldable cycle helmet, because the big issue when you're going around town is you don't want to carry a cycle helmet into every meeting you go into, and you can't stow them in your bag because you can't get your laptop out. And then this morning I was at a line bike and my helmet appeared in my hand, and the guy next to me getting a line bike said, "Where did that come from?" Well, it's in my bag. And we obviously talked about the product, and then I was at an agency this morning, and then they went, "What's that in your bag?" And it's just fascinating how, again, the conversations about, to your earlier point, it's a good product, it's an innovative product. It's fascinating how that conversation is just, fourth conversation about a collapsible helmet in a day.
By the way, I'll remind, because I'm old, I'll remind everybody about this, because once something has become normalized, once it's got through that period of critical mass, the escape velocity, whatever you want to call it, okay, we forget, we just assume, we look back on history and we concertina it, and we think there was a time when people didn't have mobile phones, and then they invented the mobile phone and everybody bought one. Trust me, it was not like that at all. As I probably said, I think in the course, in 1988, I used a mobile phone on Oxford Street, and 2 people shouted abuse at me from passing cars. Okay. I mean, literally, there's a period where doing something really early. When I told someone at a party in about 1989 that there was a company called Food Ferry in London, which kind of predated Ocado and all these other entities. When I told someone that I actually bought my groceries online and had them delivered, they laughed in my face. Okay. Now, so it's worth noting that any innovator, anybody who's innovative, if they don't have a group around them who are supportive, it's very, very lonely. You may have seen that famous sort of video which went viral of someone dancing at a festival. And one person dances and they look like a lunatic. And then a second person starts dancing. And then suddenly the whole thing effectively exponentially takes off. Technology is like that. The first iPhone took bloody ages to get to a reasonable level of penetration, by the way. It wasn't like, oh, flaming hell, smartphone, it's better than Nokia and BlackBerry. I'll go and get one of those straight away.
Yeah,
okay.
Well, so just to your point earlier about patience, you've given an illustration there of people shouting abuse at you in the, what was that?
Yeah.
89, I think you say. My first job out of uni in 2005, we were writing apps for mobiles. Now, for those on the ball, the iPhone wasn't released till 2007. So this was like the Windows mobile. So in that 20-year period, like when we said to people, we can write you apps to do these things, they're like, what? Why would you want apps on phones? So the point is, there's a 20-year period that phone was just not seen in that way. And, as you say, then Apple came out and it took a while, and you had to be really patient to survive in that game.
In that game. And solar panels will be the same. Fear of ridicule, of course, because if you do something really unusual and it goes wrong, you're not considered unfortunate, you're considered stupid. Yeah. Okay. There's a very, very high price to being an innovative consumer. Yeah. And the one way to reduce that cost is actually, by making those people feel a bit less lonely, I mean, a fascinating thing, which is absolutely extraordinary in terms of the mass diffusion curve, is High Speed 1, which goes from St Pancras out to Ebbsfleet, Ashford, etc., and also along the north coast of Kent. When it opened, I live in Sevenoaks or near Sevenoaks. When I need to get someone like King's Cross, I don't bother travelling in by train and crossing London. I drive to Ebbsfleet, take the train to St Pancras, walk across the road to King's Cross. Okay. For the first 5 years I was doing that, I probably did it like twice a month. You practically had a carriage to yourself. Okay. You got on that train and literally it was a carriage to yourself, because obviously there are other things that were going on, like there were people moving to East Kent because High Speed 1 exists, and that obviously people don't move instantaneously, right? So there are other reasons why the thing's slow, but a hell of a lot of it was just social normalizing. There are a load of people in Maidstone suddenly realized you could get to London in half the time, and so started getting to London twice as often.
Yeah. just going back, I love the phrase you just said about being less lonely or making people feel less lonely. I almost feel that's like a summary of this conversation. If you're a challenger brand, make your early customers feel less lonely, right? They're not going to be ridiculed for buying your product as opposed to the competition. And that's maybe their key to success.
I felt a small little, little sigh of relief when I saw that I got home and there was a Gusto box outside our door. Yeah. And the first moment was I thought, oh shit, I've forgotten that I've got a Gusto delivery I wasn't expecting. When I saw that my neighbor was also buying Gusto boxes, I felt, okay, I'm now no longer the weirdo in the house who's the person who orders food in a box.
Yeah. And so that's why, and that piece will keep you ordering again because they order, you're more likely to order.
I'm more likely to order, etc. Yeah.
Sorry, Sam.
No, I was going to say that's a great point that you said there of like making people feel less lonely, and we actually literally for challenger brands. And there's a question that came in quite early on in this conversation. For everyone else, I will get to the questions later, but this one just flows nicely into that from Chris Cathcart saying he's working on a challenger brand in the wealth management space. And the client has no marketing budget, like a standard startup, and is sort of looking for that quick organic growth. So like, how could you use herd mentality in that scenario?
That's you go first, Tom. It's an interesting one because obviously people tend to keep their financial affairs pretty private. However, nearly all people in wealth management get a significant amount of their new business from referrals. In some cases, the majority. And I have suggested experimenting with other forms of recommendation, like all I ask you to do as a client of mine is once a year you recommend one person. If you like, I will contact that person and not name you. I'll simply say a very good friend of yours has recommended that you speak to me, and leave it mysterious. Mm-hmm. Because there may be the fear of the recommendation there is if I recommend a financial advisor to my friend, and then my friend ended up going bankrupt or their pension halves in value, okay, I've put my friendship massively at risk. So what I'm suggesting there is one, they often say recommend as many people as you like. And my argument is no, make it one or two, because they can actually sit down and think which of my 150 people in my Dunbar number group is going to be most interested in what this person has to say. And by making it scarce, you make the ask much more reasonable. Okay, and then I've also encouraged people to experiment with what I call anonymous recommendation, because there are a lot of people who go, look, I'd be really happy for you to contact my friend, but I wouldn't be happy to put my name to it exclusively because I'm putting my reputational neck on the line.
Yeah.
And so experimentation with different modes of recommendation to see if one of them is kind of like a fat-tailed 10x breakthrough would be really, really worth doing.
Yeah, I like that. I think I'd only add, my always thinking is how do you make those conversations appear like they're happening more than they are, which can be hard when things want to stay anonymous. But actually, if you haven't got much budget, how can you find where those conversations are likely to
yes.
Because you're right, we particularly with those sorts of finances, people aren't very open, but in close networks, people are more likely to be. If someone's acquired some money and they know other people with money, there might just be a passing conversation on the golf course, like who have you used? And
yes.
if you can overlap that insight, and there's a bit more legwork into understanding that. But actually, those higher value networks where people are, maybe spend more time together and are closer, might yield it. I'd also say test the other one, right? Because it might be exactly to your point. If someone's super close to me, I maybe don't want to risk the recommendation.
No, exactly.
On the other end where it's looser, and do you know what? If their money halves and they don't speak to me again, boo-hoo, I don't care. I've not lost something. But it's testing those two approaches.
And another way would be, I would say, look at geography, and maybe you become world famous in Reading.
Yeah.
If you notice a disproportionate amount of activity in Reading, then you can either do online or digital advertising in Reading. You could even do display advertising in Reading, which will normalize you, okay, and will also reassure your existing customers, by the way, okay.
Yeah.
The other thing to do is maybe use localization in the creative. So I lost this argument with BT over many, many years, which is when they were upgrading, broadband to fiber to the cabinet. I said, don't just put important news about your broadband on the envelope or whatever it was they wanted to put. Put important news for broadband customers in Kent or in, Islington, okay? Basically every postcode has a sort of, you could even say Sevenoaks, okay? It's fine. And my argument is, if you localize something, it's by definition more relevant than something that isn't localized.
Yeah.
In other words, if there's important news for broadband customers, I go, you've just reissued your fucking legal terms and conditions. You're expecting me to read them. Okay, solve that for a game of soldiers. If it says in Sevenoaks, I go, shit, what's happening? I need to know about this.
Yeah.
And so the extent to which localization, I often think, as I said with American Express at the very beginning, there's a double whammy where your creative and your media are both doing the same job. And the fancy American Express invitation letter on quite expensive paper, combined with the opening line that said, quite frankly, the American Express card is not for everyone. Okay, that's what you might call a multiplier effect between media and creative.
Mm-hmm.
And I would also, I would argue that a lot of, personalization is a weird kind of thing where you don't, this is again, always invert. You don't have to say your ad is super relevant. It's not really important news for Rory Sutherland. Okay. Because I just go, you just personalize that, right? Yeah. Meh. Okay. It's what it's doing is it's saying it's not irrelevant.
Yeah.
Okay. In other words, what you're saying is that, I'll give you a fantastic story about personalization, which is really interesting from that point of view. What often happened in direct marketing, I think, is a lot of people discovered really interesting things and they didn't really try and plot their wider significance. And so with Boots Advantage card holders are something like 90%, 85% female, okay? That just reflects the Boots customer base to a large extent. And actually, it also reflects the design of the card a bit, to be absolutely honest. Okay, which has a sort of strong cosmetic-y kind of, it doesn't anymore, when they launched. Okay. And they used to send out these Boots Christmas catalogs. And the question was, do we actually have to personalize one to males? And we tested this. All we did in the personalization for male, the 10% of male card members, was we removed things. We made the front cover not overwhelmingly female. In other words, there were razors. We replaced sort of foundation cream. Obviously, there's a gift-giving element, so we didn't get rid of perfume and stuff. Yeah. But we got rid of sort of foundation cream and replaced it with electric razors or toothbrushes or whatever. Okay. By doing that, the number of incremental sales, because you can measure it on the Advantage card, the number of incremental sales resulting from mailing out that catalog to men was 8 times higher when you you made it de-irrelevant. Okay, in other words, you removed things which made them go, nothing to do with me.
Yeah. Wow.
And, sometimes it's as simple as that.
Yeah. Going back to the localization piece as well, I think looping it back to how we started the conversation about where not to advertise, the chap that asked the question, I haven't got a lot of budget. If you can pick an area, all of a sudden you're not saying, I want to try and reach all wealthy people over a certain age or whatever. You're saying, I'm going to find wealthy people in Reading, right? And that becomes a lot easier. Your budgets are smaller. Now, I think often people hear the concept of saying regionalize or, go local as to hamstring your ambition. You can absolutely become a global company, but take it at local regions at a time. Local to be famous in Reading, then become famous in Henley, then become famous in Swindon, and build it out that way. And therefore, you don't need the budget to say we're going to try and be the wealth managing business for the UK. You start local, you grow local. The mirror of the Facebook story at the beginning: college to college to college. Get some critical mass and explode from there. You don't need to go big to start if you don't have the budget anyway.
It's a great point. And I think that this obviously flows in, I think, to one of these other questions here from Robert, sort of saying, again, on this challenger brand topic, which is kind of the topic of today, really. But as a challenger brand with sort of fewer customers than the incumbents, how do you sort of crack the second default? Like, do you go with what others have done before, or is there a different route that you can go down?
in terms of the default, as in the default behavior, was that what the question?
It's how do you crack the second default comma?
Oh, crack. Sorry, crack. I had track. From my side, I know they'll be wider than just from the herd side, but again, it comes back to the regional side. You know, we always say to brands, you know, you can't be the biggest brand in the country or the world overnight. You can be the biggest brand on a single street or a single high street or a single town. And actually, it's easy to, you know, I always think if I'm a spaceman, you know, orbiting the planet at the moment, and I looked at the color of the Earth, if it was shaded by soft drink brands, it's going to be red. Okay, Coke is probably the biggest brand over the country, so the country will just look red. But as I zoom in, we're going to start to see these regional differences. Okay, we're going to see.
I'm Brew in Scotland. I'm in Texas, where the state drink is really Dr. Pepper. Yeah. So Coke's big in Texas, you know, but Pepsi's nowhere. Yeah. Basically, if you ask for a Dr. Pepper in Texas, they bring you one. Okay, you know, you don't try that at the club at the Ivy or the Connaught, right? Can I have a Dr. Pepper Zero, please? Right? In Texas, it started in Waco. I'm actually later on today. I'm actually going to visit the Dr. Pepper Museum in Waco on my drive to Austin. And that's a classic example. Iron Brew in Scotland. For a long time, Iron Brew was massive in Russia, because a Russian trawlerman would dock in the west coast of Scotland. Yeah. Okay, and I think they mixed it with vodka, to be absolutely honest. but I don't think that's true anymore. But there was a period where the biggest selling soft drink in Russia was Iron Brew, because they picked up the habit, something to do with the fishing thing, and then Russians would take back like cases and cases of the stuff.
And then I bet even if you zoomed in on Scotland, like even closer, we'd see little pockets where, I don't know, so-and-so's cherry cola is the winner, right? Is the category leader in a certain street. You know, and that's the thing. I think a lot of people try their resolution to be number two at such a high level that it's really hard.
But, by the way, and I've suggested this to Tom, I'm not just, there's a great PR angle here. Because we all know that pretty successful clickbait is find out how your area scores for electric car penetration. Yeah. And everybody wants evidence that their own postcode is slightly posher than the neighbouring postcode, right? So, you know, it's rather like, I don't think it's anybody from Tunbridge Wells on the call, but if you ever meet someone from Tunbridge Wells, you actually go Tunbridge Wells, which doesn't have a Waitrose, because it drives them absolutely fucking insane that Tunbridge and Sevenoaks have a Waitrose and Tunbridge Wells doesn't. Okay, so everybody has these kind of local rivalries and local comparisons and wants to believe they live in an interesting place, and so there's a wonderful PR angle here. If you can get the data and say, you know, the 50 highest postcodes for electric car penetration or whatever it may be, and the 50 lowest, obviously, as well. And people, you've got to remember, people live locally. Okay, there's a really interesting finding in terms of happiness, by the way, which I find absolutely fascinating. Which is that if you ask people a load of questions framed in your local area, how happy are you with life in Westerham? Do you enjoy, you know, do you think people in Westerham can be trusted? Do you think that everybody's incredibly positive? They go, yeah, in my local area, things are great, they're getting better, and everybody's pretty trustworthy, and they're really nice, and we look after each other. And then you ask them questions as you widen out in England, in Britain. Okay, it just gets worse and worse and worse until at the global level, everybody thinks they're going to hell in a handcart. And there's something really interesting here, which is that the local mentality, it was always the same, that local newspapers were actually quite full of good news. You know, they actually had people who celebrated their 60th wedding anniversary. There's a village fete, okay? And then you move up to a national newspaper and everything's doom and gloom. And so it's a really worthwhile thing that people are actually really happy locally.
I wonder how much of that is it Dunbar's number, where I think we can have about 150 relationships, and to your point, you know, most of our relationships are local. I wonder that's just because we can process that local feeling, but actually I don't feel very connected to the rest of the country because I don't know lots of people in the rest of the country. So it's harder for me, and this is me post-rationalizing here, I don't know this is true, but at an emotional level, I just feel closer here, and therefore my emotions are happier because, you know, most of that 150 people that I know are probably within a couple of miles of where I'm standing now, right? There's at least weighted there. It'd be fascinating to drill into that, whether there's some form of link, whether people who are a bit more nomadic, so therefore their relationships are more widely distributed, whether they actually report they're happier at a higher level because they don't have that home community. It'd be interesting.
Well, it's an interesting question, which is if you are nomadic, do you actually, if you're one of those sort of rootless people who have 3 houses, do you actually suffer from a massive kind of trust? You may not be aware of it, but you're actually suffering from a trust deficit. And people want to appear. This is a very interesting thing. I was talking to Seb James, who lives near Deal, who used to be the chief executive of Dixon's and Boots, actually. And I was joking about this thing, that in Deal, there are 3 classes of people. They're the locals. Then there are the DFLs who own property there and go there once a month. And they're part of the community. They're not locals, but they're part of the community. Then there are Airbnbs. Okay. And I just noticed this interesting phenomenon in myself and in other people, that if you're in the middle group, you do things like you go to Gillies Dry Cleaners, okay, and you get a big bag that says Gillies of Deal Dry Cleaning, right? Now, you carry that around because it says, I'm not an Airbnb-er. Because a weekend Airbnb-er isn't going to get their dry cleaning done, right? Whereas if you've actually got a place down there with clothes in it, you're going to get your dry cleaning done. Okay, so I'm just intrigued in terms of the extent. There's a book which is by, oh God, we're talking about Dunbar, and I'm getting confused now. Oh God, what's his name? His father. It's called Somewheres. People who are somewheres and people who are anywheres.
Okay.
And it sort of divides the population into about 40-50% of people are somewheres. They basically are their social local network. Then you get a 20% of people overwhelmingly represented in places like London, where let's face it, there aren't really any Cockneys anymore, right? Because if you want to meet Cockneys, you go to Kent and Essex. You don't go to the East End, right? They've all cleared out to bloody Chigwell or something, right? Yeah. Okay. And then there's a group which is about 30%, which is probably where I am actually, which is in between the two. And I'll remember what the book's called in a second. But this is very interesting about the NHS, integrated care boards. This is really fascinating.
I'll continue to fire through some of the questions, Rory. I think there's a few that are coming, but I'll keep improving.
I've just to warn you, I've got to go a tiny bit early, so I'll probably leave in about 15 minutes. The reason is that there's a speech downstairs from the Visa's chief economist on patterns of behaviour they're observing. And I can't really miss that, because if there's one person who knows what's happening in the economy, it's probably the chief economist of Visa. So you'll forgive me for that, I hope, but I will bring back to you all whatever I learn.
Not a problem at all, Rory. We'll dive into a couple more of these questions, though. But before we do, there was an interesting comment here from Claire Davies, who was also answering Chris's earlier question about wealth management. And her point was to associate with funeral directors. They're often very locally based in a key life event where wealth management would often be needed. So that could be a nice thing to do quite locally and a good association.
I mean, are those, by the way, I mean, any small business, actually, I'd say the same of a big business. There's a part of WPP called Mando Connect, run by a fantastic woman called Charlie Hills. And they're pretty much the only specialist brand partnerships agency. And I regard them as having pretty much the Midas touch, because if ever I'm stuck, I go to them and they go, well, why don't they partner with these people and we can arrange it? And generally, before you start throwing money at Rupert Murdoch or whatever, or Mark Zuckerberg, more likely nowadays, okay, the first question to ask as a business is, which other businesses could we engage in a symbiotic and cooperative relationship with, where we bring them something and they bring us something and we both benefit? Genuinely, I think those, for example, Orange Wednesdays, okay, just to give an example that's famous. There are loads and loads of small examples which people don't know about. Huge partnerships. There are huge partnerships. And all those Starbucks coffee capsules you see, okay, in the shops, and all those cans of Starbucks branded drinks, they're all made by Nestle, right? Now, the symbiosis there is Nestle go, we're pretty damn good at on-shelf facings and distribution, and we're pretty damn good at manufacturing ready-to-drink products, but we don't have a ready-to-drink coffee brand, okay? And Starbucks goes, we've got an incredibly powerful coffee brand, but we don't have any expertise in manufacturing, distribution, and ready-to-drink. Okay, and so and by the way, the Starbucks Nespresso capsules are actually manufactured by Nespresso. Okay, you didn't know that, I didn't tell you that, but that's how it works. Okay. Now, at the same level, Orange Wednesdays was not many people go to the cinema on Wednesdays. Hey, we'll make Orange customers feel great for giving them a 2-for-1 cinema trip. And the cinemas will enjoy a whole load of almost certainly incremental revenue, because without the Orange customers, the place was going to be empty otherwise. And so that's the kind of idea, which is, and I think every single, I think there are a load of areas of inquiry where every business should go once a year. We're going to sit down and we're going to ask ourselves, we're going to stop focusing on what we do with our budget and what we're doing internally and operational efficiency and software platforms. And we're going to just say, what other businesses should we make friends with?
Yeah, that's a great point. So I've got the next question. So we've got about 10 minutes then, everyone needs to shoot early. So this one I'll pose to you, Tom. So this one came in, they are an anonymous submission, but it says, what's your view on whiskey/single malt advertising? As a newbie to the category and also a non-drinker, it seems to often follow a set formula that does not have great storytelling. But is anyone actually doing a good job of challenging here?
There is a problem there, because there are a lot of category conventions. It's like women's fashion advertising in Vogue. Most people follow the category conventions. The net, which is Scotland, roaring fires, etc. Okay, and actually nothing wrong with that. The problem that creates is that the category collectively gets stuck in a rut. When everybody imitates each other, this is why you must read the Roger L. Martin. You get, I know, sorry team, but Roger L. Martin is my personal Svengali and the spiritual coach. He's written a piece on Medium called "Benchmarking is for Losers," and his argument, I would argue, I'd take it further and say that when you benchmark, you make yourself more similar to your competitors. Okay, it doesn't benefit the consumer because the consumer gets less choice. You get McKinsey and they do a load of benchmarking. They love it. It's got a load of numbers. You can compare yourself with someone similar. You then end up making yourself more similar to the other person. You lose out because you haven't got any distinguishing characteristics. The consumer loses out because they've got less choice. The category loses out because actually nobody in the category is actually growing the category. Now, there were attempts. You might remember that kind of ad made with, I think, David Beckham for a brand of Hague, which is a blended whiskey in a blue bottle. Now, I don't know how successful that was, but it was at least an attempt to present whiskey in a more youthful and generally kind of funky way. It was quite an expensive ad. Generally, whether it worked or not is a tough question. I don't know who the target audience was. I don't know the sales figures. They're probably, if you're to be honest, not so much with single malt whiskey, but you might argue that the gateway drug to whiskey is actually through the growth in cocktail drinking.
That's a good point.
My kids have a load of friends. I got them into beer drinking, my daughters. I've never really got them into whiskey drinking. But they have a lot of friends, leaning male, but not exclusively, who don't really drink whiskey, but their go-to drink of choice is an old-fashioned, for example. Okay. Now, admittedly, the argument might be that that's the gateway drug to single malts. It might, possibly. But there is an interesting question, which is the whiskey sour, the old fashioned? It's a great, there's a great drink at the Ivy, by the way, called Hammer of the Gods, which is a whiskey and beer cocktail, which sounds terrible, but it's actually delicious. Although you do end up having a fight in the car park after a couple of them. But it may be that the way you have to keep this category alive is actually lateral.
But that's what Cognac have done. So if you think Cognac, very traditionally French, very proud traditions, thought of mixing that with anything, probably 5 years ago maybe was just a no-no. Like, no, don't be a heathen. You drink this as a drink. The love and the sweat and the tears have gone to produce this. Enjoy it. They've gone down the cocktail route and they've opened that up because it's very hard to get people of a certain generation interested in it as a neat drink. So it's exactly
how you defend against the criticism of behavioural science that a lot of people say the experiments fail to replicate. My argument is that's partly the point, okay? Which is, if there were hard and fast absolute rules, people would have discovered them by now, and there would be a formula for marketing, okay? Human behavior is hugely context dependent. And so people, I'll give you an obvious example, okay? If you go to a supermarket, okay, and you see how you react to there only being one bottle of Dove left on the shelf could be, this isn't very popular, they haven't bothered to restock it, or it could be, wow, this stuff is selling out. It all depends on how people frame it, okay? You know, if you, so I had a conversation once with someone who worked at a farmer's market, and they said the problem we have is that the last 2 cucumbers never sell. Now, if it were bottles of shampoo, and you say, I've nearly sold out of this shampoo, I've only got 2 left, people will go, oh, I better buy that because it's selling really fast. With cucumbers, it's those must be the manky cucumbers that nobody wanted, because a cucumber is not fungible, whereas a bottle of shampoo is. You know, the bottle of shampoo is assumed to be identical in its contents, whereas the cucumber is all the good ones have gone. They're just those manky 2 in the tray looking a bit sad. Okay. So the extent to which we can take very, very similar bits of information and process them in a completely different way, okay? That is both, I agree, it's a problem and it's an opportunity. Now, if that weren't the case, we'd probably know a lot more about marketing. My argument is, and this is really important, okay? We've got the whole maths of marketing wrong, all right? I know that sounds like a really extreme thing. My friend Nassim Taleb, who's probably the biggest expert in the world on fat-tailed distributions, actually said in 4 words, marketing is fat-tailed. What fat-tailed means is that 10% of what you do in marketing will probably deliver 80% of the value. And yet we're judging marketing as though every single piece of marketing we do has to wash its face equally in terms of justifying its own existence, in terms of demonstrable increased sales or retention. Never mind the fact that it's harder to measure retention than it is to measure sales, which creates a massive bias. My argument is that we're not mining ore here, we're digging for treasure. And it's better to dig for treasure in the right place with a trowel than to get 3 JCBs and start plowing up a field, okay? Now, fundamentally, the failure to understand that marketing is fat-tailed, that a large part of the value of marketing is that 1 in 6, I worked on American Express for 10 or 15 years, right? On and off, but 15 years. Looking back, it wasn't obvious at the time. Everything we did seemed to make a load of sense, okay? Looking back, there were 3 things we did, one of them their idea, one of them the agency's idea, one of them a mixture of the 2, okay? Which were worth more than everything else we did in that period, in terms of the value to the company. And so I think we've got the whole maths of marketing wrong. This should be treated like R&D, it should be treated like innovation, it should be treated like pharmaceutical research, where the reason you do it is for the breakthroughs. And instead, we've created this weird world where we've driven accountability to such a kind of, what you might call such a kind of pixelated level of attribution that nobody can try anything different.
Mm. That's a great point there, Rory. I know you have to jump. So what I'm going to finish this off with is, obviously, for those of you that are on the Mad Masters course and are lucky enough that you are coming to MadFest London, which is actually the 1st to 3rd of July this year, you've all got a free ticket link. I've put it on the discussion board, or just drop me an email if you do need that link. But on day 1 of that event, at 12:45 on the brewery stage, if I'm not mistaken, Rory and Tom will be talking about a very similar topic to this. So this might have been a bit of a taster for today. But I'll throw it to you here, Tom. Is there sort of like 2 or 3 things that really stand out that are good, what that session's going to be about, and why people should make sure that they don't miss that one?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a more succinct version. I think the key thing for me is there's so much power in thinking about herds. Not exclusively, but it's the bit that's underrepresented. And to Roy's point about experimentation, understanding your herds gives you a grounding for experimentation and testing without needing the budgets of Coke to be successful. And it's going to deliver that.
Two things. The vape question on disposables. It looks like the less ethical manufacturers have found a way around this by making disposable vapes by making refillable vapes so cheap you can use them as disposables. Okay. Right. So actually, there are a whole load of things which are, it's a bit like plastic bottles. They're designated as recyclable. Not many of them actually get recycled. You feel good putting them in the recycling. A second point on the behavioral science of vapes, I think distribution is really important, because if people run out and they can't just go and buy an affordable vape, they might take up smoking again.
Yeah.
I take a similar view on flavors. Now, this is interesting. Okay. I quit smoking for 7 or 8 years. And then I went back to smoking again after 7 years quitting, and the first cigarette I had tasted fantastic. Okay, having got used to flavored vapes, if I have a cigarette now, it strikes me as disgusting. I could just about cope with a menthol one. I couldn't cope with another. That is an incredible achievement in terms of getting me to quit smoking. Okay, so the flavored vapes are, I know it appeals to kids, but it's also a really crucial way of weaning people off the association between the taste of smoke and the ingestion of nicotine. The disposable thing, I think, to be honest, people like Lost Mary have basically found a cunning way around it, which is they are disposable and rechargeable. But to be absolutely honest, does anybody know where Lost Mary came from? Very final details. I've got a dash in 2 minutes. They were an electronics company in China which had the contract to supply Panasonic with remote controls, and they lost that contract. And they thought, shit, we've got all this expertise and manufacturing capability in electric goods, and we haven't got a customer. And so they invented Lost Mary. So there you go. Okay. Sometimes you've got to pivot. Yeah.
Lovely stuff. Well, yeah, just to wrap things up there, obviously that was Rory's final answer. Tom went into a bit of detail.
And the music question, do email me, because I haven't answered that. I need to know a bit more. Thanks.
We'll do that there. So I'll do the final wrap up now. The final wrap up. But thank you very much, Rory. Obviously, those are the questions. It was a great session today. Tom, thank you as well. And thank you for giving me insight into what you guys will be speaking about at MadFest. And hopefully everyone on this call that can make it to MadFest will be at that session as well. So yeah, thank you again, Rory and Tom, and thank you all of those that joined today's session. And we will see you again next time.
And I'll let you know what Visa has to say. Thanks ever so much. Bye-bye, everybody.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.